Welcome to the August 2019 EDI Summary Webinar. This is a pre-recorded webinar that was initially aired on August 21st, 2019 for members of the Early Years Steering Group and the Children and Youth Planning Tables Data Research and Evaluation Team. My name is Brad Berg and I work with Children's Services at the Region of Waterloo. I'm very excited to have received the 2018 Early Development Instrument, or EDI, dataset, along with a couple of handy summary reports from the Offered Center at McMaster University. At the time of this recording, we have had the 2018 EDI data for just over a week. The purpose of this webinar is to provide you with a quick, high-level overview of the data provided in the summary reports. All of the information presented in this webinar is taken or directly copied from the reports provided by the Offered Center, and we've added some additional explanation and context. At the end of the webinar, I will provide details on where you can find the reports. Over the next couple of months, we'll be working to do deeper dive into the actual data set to look at the data in various ways. This includes plans to release an interactive online dashboard in collaboration with Public Health. For this webinar, we're going to quickly and briefly cover the following topics. What is the EDI and what does it measure? What does it mean to be vulnerable? And finally, we'll look at the data in a couple of different ways. The Early Development Instrument, or EDI, is a tool that was created at the Offered Center for Child Studies at McMaster University. The EDI tool is a questionnaire that is completed by teachers of senior kindergarten students in the second half of the school year. The EDI measures children's ability to meet age-appropriate developmental expectations or milestones at school entry. The EDI data can be used to inform interventions at the community level to address areas of vulnerability. As well, the EDI has been shown to predict a child's lifelong health, learning, and behavior outcomes. As one example, the EDI research across Canada shows that vulnerability at school entry is associated with poorer scores on standardized tests in grades 3 and 4. The EDI measures children's developmental health at school entry by asking questions about 5 different areas of early development listed here: physical health and well-being, social competence, emotional maturity, language and cognitive development, and communication skills and general knowledge. Each of the 5 domains are comprised of subdomains, which have several questions on the EDI instrument. The Offered Center calculates a score out of 10 for each domain using the questions and subdomains. For today's webinar, though, we're going to focus on the 5 domains as well as children who are vulnerable on one or more domain. Now that you have an idea of what the EDI is, let's take a closer look at the new data. The 2017-2018 dataset is from the 5th cycle of EDI data collection in Waterloo Region. As you can see, the cycles are typically 3 years apart, with a 5-year space between cycles 3 and 4. There are a few criteria the Offered Center uses to determine if a child's results will be included in the dataset. One of these is whether or not they have an identified special need. Now, this is something I wanted to highlight for you today. As you can see in the yellow boxes, the main report from the Offered Center contains only those children in the dataset without an identified special need. Historically, reports developed locally have included children with special needs in the same calculations and analysis as children without special needs. This has meant that for several years we have been making apples to oranges comparisons with the provincial baseline data, which only includes children without special needs. What this means is, in 2015, local reports indicated 35% of children were vulnerable on one or more domain. However, when children with special needs are removed from the analysis, the percentage of children vulnerable on one or more domain was actually 32.8%, a difference of 2.2%. While the percent changes, the overall story does not. 32.8% is still above the provincial baseline. Over the coming months, we will look at this a bit closer, and we'll be presenting our local data in a comparable way to the provincial baselines for apples-to-apples comparisons. For this webinar, while there are a couple of slides related specifically to children with special needs, we will focus on the larger group of about 5,400 children without identified special needs. And we will certainly be communicating data about children with special needs in more details in the coming months. So, to begin looking at the actual data set, let's take a look at a commonly used term when talking about the EDI, that is, vulnerable. The term vulnerable is often used interchangeably with the term scoring low. That is because children who score below the 10th percentile cutoff on the Ontario baseline population on any of the 5 domains are considered vulnerable. The Offered Centre uses Cycle 1 data as a reference for all subsequent EDI collections in Ontario. Vulnerability is based on cutoffs from that cycle. The EDI uses the 10th percentile for vulnerability in a domain because it captures all of the children who are struggling, even those whose struggles may not be apparent. When looking at graphs, diagrams, or descriptions, a higher percent vulnerable means higher percentage of children are struggling in that domain. Before we jump into the exciting part, I want to begin with the limitations rather than ending with this so that you're let down now and I have a chance to turn things around before we close out the webinar. Today is just the first look at the data and it's at the highest level. We received the data just over a week ago and I've not had time to dig in. That will come over the next couple of months and into 2020. Many of you are used to seeing the data at the neighborhood level. Today, we're looking at Waterloo Region as a whole. We will do work to map out the EDI dataset to the cities and townships as well as to the neighborhoods. This will likely be in the form of an interactive dashboard format. Over the past several months, many of us have been connected with Wellbeing Waterloo Region and diving into the important work of disaggregating data to better understand the differences in experiences and vulnerability for people from marginalized, racialized, and otherwise disadvantaged groups. Unfortunately, the EDI dataset does not contain any such variables. This is a limitation of the EDI and something that we all would like to see change. However, data can be disaggregated in several ways, including looking at the data by sex and by geographies such as the neighborhood. And one final note about looking at the difference over time or compared to the province. In past reports, you will have seen the words statistically significant. The Offered Centre has shifted to using a different type of statistical test called critical difference. We won't get into the details here because for the purposes of our look at the data, critical difference essentially denotes the same thing. If a change is critically different, we consider the change statistically meaningful and not just likely the result of chance. Now we're going to jump into the latest data set. The data from Cycle 5, the 2017-18 school year, is shown in red. Two common indicators used when looking at the EDI are vulnerable on at least one domain and vulnerable on at least 2 domains. This is because a child who is considered vulnerable on any of the domains is likely struggling, even if it's not apparent. The graph on the left shows that the percentage of children vulnerable on at least one domain in Cycle 5 was 31.7%. This is a slight decrease from 32.8% in 2015. This change is a statistically meaningful difference. On the right, you can see that the percentage of children vulnerable on at least 2 domains is 14.9%. This is a meaningful decrease compared to the 16.1% in 2015. In previous years, we've also looked at children vulnerable on at least 3 EDI domains. We call this the Multiple Challenge Index. This will be part of the data analysis over the next few months. Now, looking at comparisons between Waterloo Region, shown in blue, and Ontario in green, in Cycle 5. Waterloo Region has a higher percentage of children vulnerable on 1 or more domain, as well as a higher percentage of children vulnerable on 2 or more domains. On the left, we see the percentage of children vulnerable on at least 1 domain in Waterloo Region was 31.7 compared to 29.6% for the province of Ontario. This is a meaningful difference. On the right, the graph shows the percentage of children vulnerable on at least 2 domains was 14.9% compared to 13.9% for Ontario. This is also a meaningful difference. There's a lot of data here on this slide. When looking across the EDI domains for Waterloo Region, this graph shows several changes for Cycle 5, which is of the red bar. Looking at the domains from left to right, the physical health and well-being is the domain with the highest percentage of children in Waterloo Region that are vulnerable. In Cycle 5, 18% were vulnerable, an improvement from 19.9% in Cycle 4. The percentage of children vulnerable in the social competence domain in Cycle 5 was 10.8%. This is a slight improvement from Cycle 4. For the emotional maturity domain, 11.6 were vulnerable. Again, this is a slight improvement from Cycle 4. Language and cognitive development has been the domain where Waterloo Region has seen improvements between Cycle 3 and Cycle 4. However, in Cycle 5, 7.3% of children were vulnerable in this domain, up from 6.1% in Cycle 4. All of the changes in these first four domains that I just mentioned are critical or meaningful differences. For the fifth domain, on the far right, communication skills and general knowledge, the 0.3% change is not considered statistically meaningful difference. While the number is slightly different from between Cycle 4 and Cycle 5, we can consider this essentially unchanged. Looking again to compare Waterloo Region to Ontario for Cycle 5, this time by domain. At first look, it seems like there is a greater percentage of children in Waterloo Region who are vulnerable compared to Ontario in 4 of the 5 domains. However, the difference between the rates for emotional maturity is not a meaningful difference. Further, the language and cognitive development shown here to have a lower percentage of children vulnerable in Waterloo Region. The difference between Waterloo Region at 7.3% and Ontario at 7.5% is not a meaningful difference. Therefore, the only meaningful differences between Waterloo Region and Ontario in the physical health and well-being domain, social competence, and communication skills and general knowledge domain. The report from Offord doesn't just report on the percentage of children who are considered vulnerable. The report also shows the percentage who are at risk or on track in each domain. As with the definition of vulnerability, at risk and on track are determined using percentile cutoffs from the baseline Ontario-wide Cycle 1 EDI data. I'm showing you this now so that you don't wonder what it is when you see it in the report. However, we're not going to get into this in detail today, but it is in the report for your reference and will be part of future analysis. As mentioned earlier, there are 16 subdomains, which all roll up to the 5 EDI domains. The summary report provides a high-level overview of how children in Waterloo Region score compared to the province on each of the subdomains. The physical health and well-being domain are shown here on this slide as an example. Subdomains are not described using terms like vulnerable, on track, or at risk. Rather, scores are identified representing children who met all or almost all of the developmental expectations in that subdomain, some of the developmental expectations, or few or none of the developmental expectations in that subdomain. Over the next few months, we'll take a closer look at subdomains. One of the ways that we're able to disaggregate data is to look at the domains by age and by sex. As you can see here, generally, there are more boys than girls identified as vulnerable, especially in the emotional maturity and social competence domains, where the percent vulnerable for boys is around 3 times higher than for girls. We see a similar trend for older versus younger children. Older children are defined as those above the mean age, and younger children are defined as those below the mean age. In Waterloo Region, our mean age for Cycle 5 was 5.66 years. These graphs show that more younger children are vulnerable than older children in each domain. In addition to the EDI questions, teachers, to the best of their knowledge, also provide information regarding the student's childcare arrangements prior to kindergarten as well as during the SK school year, whether or not they have attended community learning programs, and whether or not they attended JK. This data can be used to help provide context and will help to explain EDI vulnerability in our community. We've included a sample of the responses here. The fulsome summary is provided in the report. We're now going to take a quick look at children with special needs. Under the definition of special needs is a broad range of disorders affecting behavior, communication, as well as physical or intellectual development. Generally, for the EDI, the child has already been identified as having special needs through a medical, physical, or mental health diagnosis by a doctor, pediatrician, psychologist, or an assessment by a speech and language pathologist. For Cycle 5, 384 children in Waterloo Region were identified as having special needs. 72% were boys and 28% were girls. The special needs data is taken from pages 13 to 15 in the summary report from Offered. The report does include additional information that we won't be digging into today. This graph shows that 82.3% of children with special needs were vulnerable in at least one domain in Cycle 5, and 66.1% were vulnerable in at least two domains. As you can see, there's a much higher percentage of children with special needs who are considered vulnerable compared to the larger group of children without special needs. When looking across the EDI domains for children with special needs in Waterloo Region, the percent of children vulnerable in the physical health and well-being domain in Cycle 5 was 54.2%. The percent vulnerable in the social competence domain was 46.9%, and so on. Like with the overall vulnerability, we see a larger percentage considered vulnerable compared to the larger group. And this concludes the very high-level summary of the EDI data shared by the Offered Center in the snapshot reports. These two reports are now posted online. You can find these reports by typing in the URL at the bottom of the slide, or by going to the Region of Waterloo's website and clicking on Living Here, then Childcare and Early Learning, then Planning and Research. The reports will also be on the Children and Youth Planning Tables, Resources and Research webpage. Thank you for taking the time to view this webinar, and stay tuned for more information about the latest cycle of EDI data and what we can learn together.